Dark Souls. What's the first thing you think of when hearing that name? Maybe it's the insane level of difficulty in each and every installment of the series, or maybe it's the lore that easily compares to the likes of Five Nights at Freddy's. But there's something else I believe Dark Souls is extremely well known for: the bosses, and out of every other game in the franchise, there's one in particular that has an absolutely phenomenal boss lineup. This of course being Dark Souls 3, and in this video I'll be ranking every single boss in the game, including DLC bosses, but before that, I'd like to say I'll be ranking them based on design, gameplay, personal enjoyment, and lore, if necessary. Also, if you enjoy this video going forward, then please make sure to smash that like button, leave a comment down below, and hit that big red subscribe button, because I'm currently aiming for a total of 1,000 subs by the end of the year, and any help in that goal would be much appreciated. However, with that out of the way, let's begin talking about some Dark Souls bosses. Curse-Rotted Greatwood is simply annoying. There's nothing about this boss that makes it difficult aside from the stupid eggs all over its body that you have to aim for if you want to inflict any actual damage. But the problem is, you first have to find them and you also have to reach them, which can sometimes be pretty difficult because this guy is huge and there's not a whole lot of eggs on him. So you can instead try and aim for the eggs on his crotch, which don't blow up as quickly. However, this isn't really viable unless you've almost beaten him, because the damage these specific eggs take is really low, but I think this is actually pretty decent gameplay. It's difficult to aim for specific eggs, so you're given the option to aim for his crotch, but doing this puts you at greater risk because of the giant arm sticking out of the boss's stomach. However, no matter how you look at it, this boss fight just kind of drags on. Although, I'll admit, the design of this boss is pretty good. It kind of reminded me of that one tree from the Lost Children arc in Berserk. I'm not sure if that's what they were going for, but considering this game was made by Miyazaki, the chances of it being based off of a Berserk monster are pretty likely, although I just do not enjoy this fight at all. I would literally rather watch a Lanky Box video in its entirety than fight this boss again.
Riz her up!
So this boss, despite having a half-decent design, is pretty bad, and definitely the worst boss in Dark Souls 3.
Half-Eite's Spear of the Church is not your standard Dark Souls boss. They're not a giant covered in armor or a dragon that shoots lasers from its mouth. Instead, they're simply a soldier of some kind that knows a few spells. But because this boss is so humanoid, they have a very low poise, which makes them easily staggered. So damage can be dealt really quickly on bosses such as these, and if I'm being honest, I don't really like this kind of boss in most FromSoft games. The only time they're done sort of well is in Bloodborne, but that didn't carry over to Dark Souls 3, which makes this boss completely uninteresting and almost a complete pushover. And design-wise, there isn't much to say. Their design is really just a whole bunch of nothing, and doesn't really have any of the extravagance that makes Dark Souls bosses memorable. Like hell, I'm writing this script the same day I recorded the footage you're currently watching, yet I can barely even remember what this boss looks like. And if I'm being honest, I would put this boss at last on the ranking if I didn't personally hate Curse-Rotted Greatwood. But that's enough of that, so let's sum up my thoughts on this boss.
It's fucking useless.
Ancient Wyvern is a pretty boring boss, because you're not really fighting the boss itself, instead you're going around and above him, so you can land an attack on his head from above, all whilst making your way through a horde of dragon creatures, but you don't have to fight with any of them. Instead you can just slither your way up to the ledge and dive down on the boss's head, and you can just attack the boss normally, but you'll do practically nothing. So unless you're planning on fighting this boss for about half an hour, you only really have one choice, and this choice just so happens to make the fight a complete and utter cakewalk. And the design of this boss is by no means bad, but when it comes to dragons in FromSoft games, this one just doesn't compare. Even in Dark Souls 3 alone, there's multiple dragon-like bosses that are just way cooler in every way, because unlike this boss, they actually manage to feel unique, while Ancient Wyvern just feels extremely bland and wholly uninspired, which is completely different different to how FromSoft games usually feel, although I do get more enjoyment from this fight than I do whilst playing the two that came before it, so I think it does deserve this spot. Crystal Sage is the first boss I'll be talking about in this video to actually have decent gameplay. But why? Well, the boss actually summons multiple clones of itself throughout the fight, and the only way to tell them apart from the real Sage is by checking the colour of their magic. The clones have blue magic, whilst the real Sage has purple magic, and you're basically presented with an option here. You can either look for the real one right away and focus all of your attention on them, which leaves you open to being attacked by all of the clones, or you can aim for the clones first and then aim for the real one. But this idea is ruined when you realise that all of the clones respawn after the boss teleports, something the Sage does after receiving a certain amount of damage. If the clones were constantly there and didn't despawn at all, then it would give the player a much greater incentive to aim for them first, thus making the boss considerably more difficult. However, this isn't the case. Instead, you're given a brief window in between the clones respawning, which allows you to heal up and prepare for the clones to respawn, thus making the boss way easier and less rewarding than it could have been. And the boss's design is decent as well. I like the sort of Witch Doctor style they were going for, but like the Ancient Wyvern, it just felt a little bland, and I think my biggest issue with the boss's design is that it just doesn't feel like a boss. It feels like an enemy that'll just be repurposed later on in the game to make an area more difficult, and that's exactly what they do with Crystal Sage. I don't hate this boss, but no aspect of this fight has particularly stuck with me. It was completely mediocre in every aspect. However, I think that's fine. It may not excel in any area, but it's still a decent fight. Deacons of the Deep is not a good boss fight. In fact, it has all the hallmarks of a terrible fight. However, I kinda love it, and I'll explain why in a minute, but first I do actually need to explain why this boss is bad. Well, to begin with, you're basically just fighting through a horde of angry Deacons, all of which are more suited to long-range attacks, just so you can find one Deacon that's glowing red, because killing him lowers the health bar a bit, and you'll repeat this until eventually the Archdeacon rises from the floor, that you can attack until the health bar has been completely diminished. However, there's not really anything that makes him special, so attacking him is just as easy as attacking any other Deacon, and this fight is ridiculously easy no matter what, but if you have a heavy weapon like the Great Club that I hold so dear, then this fight is just an absolute piss take. And I don't even know how I'm supposed to talk about the design, because this boss fight is just a collective of enemies that you've likely already seen before. The only unique enemy here is the Archdeacon, because he's a little shorter and wears that funny hat that the Pope usually wears, which is kind of cool, but that doesn't make him feel like a boss. So after all that, why did I place this boss at 21st? Well, as you already know, I love the Great Club. It's a fantastic strength weapon, but this fight in particular is perfect for my club, because it just knocks all of the Deacons over, and if you happen to hit one of the more rotund Deacons, then they'll create a domino effect that's hilarious to watch. And yes, I realize I'm giving them special treatment, but you know what? I don't care. They're the only boss in the game that I'm doing this for, so I think that's okay. Anyways, this is my conclusion for Deacons of the Deep.
Yeah, baby! That's what I've been waiting for.
Champions Gravetender and Gravetender Greatwolf is the last boss I'll be talking about in this video that I don't like. Every boss after this point is simply incredible, but before that, let's talk about Champions Gravetender, and you'll notice I only said Champions Gravetender because these two are like completely different fights. When you enter the boss arena, the only one there is the champion, and the Greatwolf doesn't show up until after he's called, but even after being called, it still takes him a minute to show up. So while that's happening, you're just left to lay an absolute beatdown on the champion, because he's like an even weaker version of Halfite, and I think the devs tried to compensate for this by putting a few smaller wolves around the arena, but really, Champions Gravetender is just piss easy. Although that's not the case for Gravetender Greatwolf. The wolf is actually a bit challenging, and if they were a part of the fight to begin with, it would have been much harder. However, that's not the case. Instead, you can basically deal with them one after another, which is sad because this fight actually had the potential to be a really good double battle if it was executed properly. I have no clue why they weren't together from the beginning of the fight, but that's how it was, and because of that, it's made way easier and less enjoyable as well. And when it comes to design, there isn't really anything to say. Champion's Gravetender is the same as Halfite. His design is completely and utterly forgettable, even though I fought him fairly recently, and Gravetender Greatwolf is just a big wolf. There really isn't that much to it. The only thing I noticed about him was some extra detail used on his mouth, but that's it. However, I did enjoy this fight. I think they messed up the gameplay a little, and they could have gotten a bit more creative with the wolf, but I still enjoyed it, so I'm gonna stick it right here. Vordt of the Boreal Valley is not that difficult of a fight. You can very easily attack him from behind and avoid most hits, as he doesn't really have any way to turn the tables on you, except for his charging attack, and because of that the gameplay can be a little unengaging. However, his second phase is much more interesting. During his second phase, the charge attacks become more common, and he's also able to inflict frost damage, which really changes the flow of the fight and makes it much more fun. And there is another Outrider Knight from Irophil that I'll be talking about later who I much prefer, but even so, I still like Vordt's monstrous design, which is likely a direct result of him holding the Pontiff's left eye, and we can actually see what he looked like before his transformation later on in the game, and they barely even look like the same person, which shows just how effective the ring was on Vordt. It made him some form of bull-like monster that charges at its enemies to stop them at all cost. High Lord Wolnir is a very easy boss, because to beat him you simply need to break 3 golden bracelets and then he'll be dragged into the abyss, because there's no longer anything left to protect him from it, and the abyss surrounding him does slowly begin to cover the boss arena. However, the bracelets he's wearing don't take long to break, especially if you're carrying a heavy weapon, so unless you seriously mess up, there's no way that you'll find the Vape Lord difficult, and that's really sad to me because Wolnir is a really cool boss, and I can see what they were going for. They were trying to force players to act fast, because the boss gets more difficult over time, and in theory that sounds cool, but in execution it just doesn't work as well as it should.
And even though I haven't put Wolnir very high up on the list, I still think his design is great because of 2 major details. The first being his crown, which you'll notice is a very odd shape, and that's because Wolnir created his crown by taking the crowns of other lords, making him the one true king. Also, the Abyss having already gnawed off his lower half makes it even more incredible that he's still holding on, well, until his bracelets are destroyed and he's dragged into the Abyss. Iudex Gundyr is the first Dark Souls 3 boss, and I think he's a perfect introductory boss. His attacks don't feel extremely complicated, but they don't feel easy to avoid either, and I think if you're just getting into Dark Souls and you're starting with the 3rd game, then Gundyr should ease you in perfectly. In fact, it feels like he was specifically made to train the player. For example, some of his attacks are delayed and some of them are more erratic, especially during his second phase. So even though the boss isn't difficult, that's fine, because he doesn't need to be. If anything, he's like a tutorial boss, but unlike a lot of games which force you into a tutorial section that treats you like a literal toddler with 0 gaming experience, Dark Souls 3 doesn't. Instead, it feels completely natural and not at all disrespectful to the player. And Gundyr's design is absolutely stunning. The faces built into his armor and helmet make him look a lot more threatening and kind of reminiscent of an Iron Maiden, which would actually make a lot of sense because Iudex Gundyr actually means battle judge, so a form of judgment being built into his design would make a whole lot of sense, and it would be really creative as well. Obviously, I can't confirm whether or not this is actually the case, but that's just how I think when I look at Iudex Gundyr. Also, I find it really cool that when Gundyr failed to relink the flame, he instead acted as a sheath for the coiled sword so that he could test any champion who dares to take it from him, because it shows how dedicated of a warrior he was. Now, if this was a video where I solely ranked the first boss of every Dark Souls game, then Iudex Gundyr would be number 1, but I'm afraid that isn't the case, so I can only put him here because despite him being a fantastic boss, Dark Souls 3 is full of fantastic bosses. Old Demon King is a cool boss. The way his fire is used throughout the fight is really interesting. Creating a circle of flames that goes outwards and then back inwards sounds extremely simple, but when you combine that with excessive attacks, it actually makes for a pretty enjoyable situation. And the ability to summon meteors from the sky is also a really cool idea, but my main issue with the boss is its similarity to the multiple other demons spread throughout the game, because it makes him feel less special, and outside of a few unique attacks, there's
not much that separates him from the other demons you've already seen. Although I think having smaller demon fights here and there does sort of build this fight up a bit. And the old Demon King's design is quite nice. They did a fantastic job at emphasizing his age by making him look really shabby and disheveled. Also, I don't know whether or not this was intentional, but it kind of looked like he was burning out, and if that was intentional, then that's a genius design choice. And because of its design, it managed to stand out really well. Unlike the gameplay, the design of this boss felt really unique, and let's be honest, the gameplay isn't that bad either. It's just a little similar to the demons we've already seen. But that isn't really that big of a deal, so putting the old Demon King in 17th is pretty reasonable, I believe. Yhorm the Giant feels like an early version of Rykard, because the fight forces you to wield a new weapon found exclusively in his boss arena called the Storm Ruler, which he made solely to kill him so that his people, who referred to him as a coward, would now have their own cowardice revealed. So if you want to do any actual damage to Yhorm, then the Storm Ruler is the way to go, but the problem is, Rykard had 2 whole phases, so even though you were able to do ludicrous amounts of damage to him with the Serpent Hunter, it didn't matter because he had so much health. But that isn't the case for Yhorm. In fact, he only has 1 health bar and it takes about 4 hits with the Storm Ruler to fully finish him off. And he's not a complete pushover because some of his attacks are genuinely brutal and he can clear a severely large amount of distance in quite a short amount of time. But even so, the fight doesn't go on long enough for that to be considered a problem. And honestly, I don't like Yhorm's design that much, but his weapon and style of fighting is really nice. He's using both hands to attack with his machete, because the one he cared for most was killed, which means that Yhorm no longer has any need for a shield as he has no one left to protect. And you can argue that makes him more powerful and ferocious than ever before. Oceiros the Consumed King is another really good fight, but it has one glaring issue, and I'll talk about that in a moment, because I first want to focus on the positives, like the incredibly chaotic attack pattern which reminded me of enemies from Elden Ring. In Elden Ring, a lot of enemies are given a variety of different attacks that allow them to counter the player, like a tail whip for example, and the first phase of Oceiros' fight may not have any of these advanced attacks, but his second phase easily makes up for that. So what's the big issue I have with him then? Well, during his first phase, Oceiros does not shut up, and I wouldn't mind this if it were a cutscene, but it isn't. Instead, you're just fighting him while he yaps on about his invisible child. It's only after he vores his own child does the needless yapping cease. And Oceiros' design is also incredible. It's so different from every other dragon in Dark Souls 3. It makes him look old and weak, but in a strange way kind of threatening. And the way he acts during his second phase makes me see him as more of a dog than anything else. He definitely doesn't feel like a dragon at all. During his first phase, he feels like a wise old man, and during his second phase, he feels like a rabid beast that's fighting out of necessity. I like how they designed him. It really sets him apart from every other dragon in the game. Dragonslayer Armour is a simple boss, although there's 2 things I really like about it. Firstly, I really enjoy how his shield is used during the battle. It's not too uncommon for a Dark Souls enemy to incorporate their shield into their attack pattern, but even so, I still think it's worthy of praise because it was used to such a great effect. In a fight, you'd usually aim to stay by the shield of your enemy if you're trying to recover from a recent hit, but due to how smoothly the boss uses his shield in battle, that changes quite a bit. And the game does a great job at encouraging you to be more aggressive during the fight, because there's a monster named the Pilgrim Butterfly on the side of the arena that will begin firing projectiles at you, which aren't impossible to dodge, but when you combine their attacks with the Dragonslayer, it becomes a lot more difficult. Also, the range on his weapon is really punishing. It stops the player from trying to distance themselves. Instead, the game encourages you to be aggressive yet again by going towards the boss, as it's easier to dodge some of his attacks if you're near him. And his design gives off a very rough sort of feeling. It doesn't really feel like armor. Instead, the boss feels more like a dragon in the shape of armor. After all, its color makes it look like it's completely constructed of dragon scales, and the stony texture it has works really well on the shield specifically. But I think its best aspect is the sharp helmet, which really emphasizes the Dragonslayer armor's height, and the little red hair sticking out the top gives it a fiery touch, completing the overall design. Champion Gundyr is the only repeat boss in Dark Souls 3, and usually I don't really like repeat bosses, but in this case I don't feel that way. Champion Gundyr is like a perfect version of Iudex Gundyr, something that would feel completely out of place in the beginning of the game, but here it feels fine, and I do genuinely love this boss. His attacks are so well coordinated. Instead of only using his glaive like in the Iudex fight, he now uses every ability at his disposal, like kicking you to end a combo and shoving you with his shoulders to start a combo. Every attack he uses feels really clean and cool. Although there really isn't anything for me to say when talking about Champion Gundyr's design, because it's the exact same as Iudex Gundyr, the only difference being that Champion Gundyr has glowing red eyes, whilst Iudex doesn't. But again, that doesn't change anything, which is fine because Gundyr's design is completely fine to begin with, so even though Gundyr didn't get some sick makeover, he's still very cool, which is why he's unbelievably deserving of this rank. Demon from Below and Demon in Pain. There is another one, but I'll talk about them after these two, because saying all of their names at once may sound a little weird. Anyways, Demon from Below and Demon in Pain are a very good gank fight, because the battle starts with one of them charging at you, whilst the other one attempts to inflict toxic damage from afar, and this is perfect. When you're being attacked by two bosses at the same time, it can feel a little unfair, especially if they're just two random bosses that have been stuck together for the sake of it. And yes, I am talking about Godskin Duo. It's a terrible example of a gank fight because both of the bosses are highly aggressive and have little to no balancing between them, unlike Demon from Below and Demon in Pain, which are specifically made to attack in tandem. But after beating them both, Demon in Pain will transform into the Demon Prince, who is somewhat similar to the old Demon King, but there's stuff about the Demon Prince I really like. For example, they gave him wings, allowing him to dive at the player, and he also has the ability to create sentries in the shape of miniature suns, kind of like an early fire giant, so gameplay wise, this is a perfect gank fight that leads on to another very competent boss. And their designs are great. Giving the demons a more hollow and animalistic feeling works surprisingly well, and that combined with their fiery skin is just so threatening. But the Demon Prince is even better. Giving him wings not only works from a gameplay standpoint, but also a design standpoint as well. It makes him look way more majestic and imposing, two things that don't normally go hand in hand, but in this case they do, and because of that this boss is absolutely magnificent. Dancer of the Boreal Valley is a completely mental fight. There's no other boss in Dark Souls 3 that has such insane movements, and due to this, the fight is made really fun and interesting. Also, the twin blades she's wielding during the second phase of her fight make for some really great combo attacks. For example, there's one attack where she just spins around whilst holding out each of her blades, which doesn't sound too bad, but that combined with her variety of other attacks makes the dancer really challenging. Also, the grab attack she uses during her first phase is my worst nightmare. Also, the dancer is an Outrider knight like Vordt, however I think she's a little bit more interesting, as it's likely she was one of Guinevere's daughters, and because of this relationship, she was made a dancer by Pontiff Sulyvahn, which was most likely an attempt at humiliation by the Pontiff, but after learning of his strength, she's granted the position of Outrider knight, and sent to Lothric Castle alongside Vordt of the Boreal Valley. Although technically she's escaped the Pontiff, his influence over her is still very clear to see. Not only does she have the Pontiff's right eye, which transforms her into a monster much like Vordt, but she's also carrying weapons that very much resemble the Pontiff's, and these very swords make her whole fight seem like one big light show due to how elegantly she wields them. And finally, her cloak gives her a very ghost-like feeling that really fits with the whole fight. Pontiff Sulyvahn is a very intense boss, and when you're walking down the aisle to face him, that's made abundantly clear. In mere seconds, he charges directly at you with one of his blades held out in front of him, which isn't that bad, but Pontiff Sulyvahn manages to keep that intense feeling strong throughout the entire fight, and I'm not even talking about his second phase, which I definitely need to do because Pontiff Sulyvahn's second phase introduces a really fun gimmick. During the Pontiff's second phase, we're able to see a hollow clone of him that'll fight by his side at the cost of revealing his next move. And yes, that means you're technically just dealing with the same attack twice, but I really like the idea because it makes sure the player doesn't have a moment of rest. However, the clone can be killed, so that's a good way of making his fight a little less stressful. And Sulyvahn's design is really intricate. Firstly, we can spot his eyes wrapped around his shoulders, which he used to control the people of Irithyll, but it gets even better due to Pontiff Sulyvahn's swords that kind of represent his own downfall in a way, because one of them he obtained by taking the power of the profaned flame, and the other blade he obtained whilst infiltrating the blades of the Dark Moon, which resembled sorcery more than anything else, something the old royal family heavily looked down upon. All of this combined would eventually cause his death. Everything he did made more enemies for him that would eventually come for his life. Even after becoming one of the most powerful men in the world, he still couldn't stop the rekindling. Soul of Cinder is the final boss of Dark Souls 3, and basically the ultimate fighter. He's capable of switching fighting styles mid-fight. At one point he could be doing backflips, and the next second he could be firing magic lasers at you, which makes this fight completely chaotic but in a really cool way that forces the player to constantly adapt to the boss. And his second phase is great as well, however, they removed his ability to switch fighting styles, which I found a little disappointing, and I definitely have ranked him even higher if they did more than just buff him. But I'll admit, the lightning attacks they gave him, combined with the mental combos he starts using during his second phase, make for a decent substitute. And Soul of Cinder being basically the will of every Lord of Cinder from the past testing you is really interesting, and it explains why he's able to change his fighting style mid-battle. He's just an amalgamation of all the lords that have come and gone over the years, trying to test your worthiness to link the flame for one last time. Also, the Soul of Cinder really does look like a physical manifestation of fire, so finishing the franchise with him is pretty much perfect. You're facing the combined force of every lord. Honestly, I don't think they could have come up with a better way of finishing the franchise. Lothric Younger Prince is a very cool boss that prioritizes speed above all else, which is made very obvious when he teleports straight to you at the beginning of the battle, and basically just lets himself be pulled by the weight of his own sword. And even though his teleportation ability doesn't harm you, that's fine, because its main goal is to confuse the player, and every so often, the boss's attack pattern will switch up. Instead of teleporting directly to you, the prince will instead appear above you so he can land an attack from above. Or he can teleport away to charge up a bigger attack that requires perfect timing to dodge. And because his attack pattern shifts so easily, the prince is pretty damn difficult. But this boss actually has two phases, and during his second phase you'll also have to deal with the Elder Prince, who's receiving a piggyback from his younger brother, and the way they attack together is really cool. It's not like your average gank fight. If anything, they feel like just one boss, despite having two different health bars, because if you just aim to hit them from behind, then you'll deal damage to both of them. So what did they gain from teaming up? Well, the Elder Prince, being more skilled in magic, can now handle long-range attacks, which gives the younger prince more chances to build distance between you and him. Also, the younger prince has been buffed, allowing him to pull off even more attacks, and that combined with his elder brother makes for some really engaging gameplay. And I don't have too much to say about their design, but making them crawl across the boss arena is a really nice touch, because it shows just how determined they are to stay barricaded inside their castle, to the point where they'll even use teleportation just to fight you off. And their second phase is even better, because it makes both princes feel like a singular entity, which can't survive without the existence of the other, and they easily accomplish this by just having the Elder Prince get a piggyback. Aldrich, Devourer of Femboys, is yet another great boss, because they manage to strike a very strong balance between close range and long range attacks. Also, I like bosses that punish you for not being careful. For example, when Aldrich teleports, it creates a gas around them, which inflicts some pretty serious damage, so the game is kind of forcing you to stay alert, and I know that may sound really simple, but I like when bosses have movements that deal damage to the player. Crystal Sage constantly teleports, but it doesn't matter because it does no damage, which means there's almost zero threat once you've cleared the distance between you and the Sage, unlike the femboy Devourer, who can absolutely crush you at any range. And Aldrich's design is simply incredible, and possibly my favourite boss design from Dark Souls 3, because Aldrich has the body of Dark Sun Gwyndolin, the femboy prince, and the weapon they're carrying is Gravelord Nito's hand built into a pole sword. So Aldrich's design is an amalgamation of Dark Souls 1 bosses, so I really love their design, but that isn't the end of it. From Software specifically placed Aldrich in the same arena where you battle Ornstein and Smough, which means Smough was likely devoured, because unlike Ornstein, Smough stayed behind and his fate is just pure karma at its finest. A cannibal executioner was cannibalized by Aldrich. Really, it doesn't get much better than that. Abyss Watchers is a crazy fight, to say the least, because after entering the boss arena, you'll very quickly realise that you're up against more than one fighter, although so are they. This boss is made up of multiple different knights that have all been corrupted by the Abyss, so they have very little control of their own actions, which means they'll sometimes aim for each other, which does make this boss easier, but that doesn't matter, because the pure insanity of this fight resembles a British pub while the footy's on. And it's truly wonderful. Also, the fight is basically just one big love letter to Artorias, a boss from the Dark Souls 1 DLC that I would have fought if I had the patience to play through the entirety of that game. Don't blame me, blame Gravelord Nito. But that aside, I do really love the inspiration they took from Artorias here, because even though I haven't fought him myself, I think he's a really cool boss. But hold up, Abyss Watchers have a second phase, and during their second phase you'll only be facing one of them, which I surprisingly didn't mind, and it's because the Abyss Watchers are competent enough enemies on their own, with really cool attack patterns, so even though the second phase is just an Abyss Watcher after using an Ember, it doesn't matter because the fight is still absolutely incredible. And the Abyss Watchers design made me think of them as bandits, primarily due to the daggers wrapped around their torso and the fact they're wearing armour that's mostly made out of leather really supported this idea I had of them, but I want to focus more on their relation to Artorias and therefore Guts Berserker armour, which was the direct inspiration for Artorias, and you can see that shine through in this battle as well. The way the Abyss Watchers move is completely bizarre and it very clearly resembles the Berserker armour. I actually think the Abyss Watchers replicated the Berserker armour better than Artorias considering what I've seen of him, and because of all that I couldn't possibly put the Abyss Watchers any lower. They're an absolutely phenomenal boss through and through. Sister Friede is the main boss of the first DLC, and I've got something very important to say to her. Fuck you. I cannot even begin to comprehend why they thought 3 phases was acceptable.
This is beyond the pale! You hear me? Beyond the pale!
But putting my differences aside, this fight is great and I love it, like I do every fight in the top 10. But why? Well, Sister Friede's first phase is pretty simple. You're basically just fighting a nun carrying a scythe, and she does have one attack in this phase that makes her invisible until she attacks again, but outside of that, there isn't much to her first phase. Although the second phase kicks it up a notch by introducing Father Arundel into the equation, who you've probably seen in all those memes. And Father Arundel's inclusion is really fun, it changes up the flow of the fight really well. However, this phase isn't difficult in the slightest. They share a health bar, which means you can basically just target Father Arundel and do ludicrous amounts of damage to the both of them. But I believe the first 2 phases are actually just made to wear you and your Estus out, because phase 3 is much harder.
The third phase begins with Father Arundel dying, so you'll only be fighting Sister Friede again, who's had a serious power-up. During this phase, they managed to strike a perfect balance between long-range and short-range attacks. Also, she's incredible at turning the tables by using her immense speed to easily counter you. Overall, the gameplay just feels like an early version of Malenia, which is pretty common for Dark Souls 3. A lot of bosses in this game are like the predecessors to Elden Ring bosses, and for someone who started with Elden Ring, this is really cool to me. Now, Friede's design is seemingly a more gothic spin on your usual nun's attire, and the scythe she's carrying is imbued with the power of frost, which makes sense considering where this fight takes place, but I believe Sister Friede is carrying that scythe because her main goal is to put an end to the Age of Fire, which is a little ironic because during his second phase, fire is spread all throughout the room after Father Arundel begins his attack. And I need to talk about Father Arundel too, because his design is hilarious. He's literally stuck to a chair, so throughout the second phase, his chair can be seen rocking from side to side as he pulls himself with the weight of his giant bowl. Also, Sister Friede succumbing to the fire is a really nice touch, because it shows she's willing to do anything to stop you from continuing the Age of Fire, to the point where she'll even fight fire with fire. Darkeater Midir is the second best dragon I've had the pleasure of fighting in any Soulsborne game, which is very hard for me to say because this boss made me drown into a deep despair, as it took me half a day to beat him, but no matter how much I'd love to, I can't deny that Darkeater Midir is incredible. Although, what makes him that way? Well, firstly, his fight flips the player's idea of dragons on its head. Usually it makes the most sense to aim for the back of a dragon, because even though you do less damage, you're considerably safer, but that isn't a viable option when facing Midir, because any hits landed on his body are useless, so if you want to actually deal damage, then aiming for its head is the only way to go. Midir's attacks are also very rapid and hard hitting, which makes this fight very intense at times, but I want to specifically focus on the laser that Midir uses, because it heavily resembles the ability Placidusax uses in Elden Ring, so it's very clear to me that Midir is the direct inspiration for Placidusax, and I believe that Midir could have been just as great, possibly even better, if he was made today, because with every game FromSoft makes, they just keep improving in every aspect. So if they had the ability to make Midir like Placidusax, then this would have been my favourite dragon fight of all time. And Midir's design feels very robust and jagged, mostly due to the crystal formations that seem as if they're ripping out from inside his own skin. And his wings being completely torn apart explains why Midir rarely flies during the fight, instead he mostly stays on the ground, and attacks in a way that I can only describe as feral. Midir also spews fire like almost every other dragon in a Soulsborne game, but Midir's flames having a dark tinge to them is really on brand, and seeing as we're on the topic of Midir spewing, I might as well mention his mouth, because they did a surprising amount of detail work on this particular area that really supports my original idea of him being feral. Gael Slave Knight is the true hero of Dark Souls, and that shines through in his battle. However, his first phase isn't actually that difficult or interesting. Outside of some brutal combos, there isn't really that much to his first phase, which you might find a little weird, especially when you consider the fact that Gael is the penultimate DLC boss. But here's the thing, I believe this was intentional, because his second phase is a whole other beast in of itself. During Gael's second phase, it truly feels like you're up against someone that's overflowing with determination. Firstly, they gave him a crossbow, which isn't the most threatening thing, but it is very unique and cool. Also, it makes him feel even more determined to me, as if he's using every single weapon in his arsenal just to beat you. And the world itself is assisting him, because lightning begins to strike all over the boss arena during Gael's second phase. Although, without a doubt, my favourite thing about his second phase is the cloak he's wearing that acts more like a weapon than an actual piece of gear. Whilst attacking, you'll soon realise that each of his slashes are followed very closely by his crimson cloak that is perfect at punishing you. So even though the first phase is a little lackluster, it doesn't matter because the second phase more than makes up for it. And Gael's design is also very interesting. It likely takes inspiration off of Guts, but not his Berserker armor. Instead, this boss seems heavily inspired by Guts during the Black Swordsman arc, primarily due to the crossbow. The way he uses it during the battle felt very reminiscent of how Guts fought before obtaining the Berserker armor. Although there is one more thing that reminded me of Guts during this fight, and it was Gael's cloak. I don't know if this was intentional or not, but it could very well have been. One of the things that Berserk emphasizes is Guts' cloak, so if Gael is actually inspired by Guts, then his cloak playing a major role in the second phase would make a lot of sense, and it'd be really cool, but even if that wasn't the intention, it doesn't matter, because it's still cool nonetheless. Nameless King is my favourite boss in all of Dark Souls 3, however his first phase is really nothing special. You're basically just chasing down the dragon he's riding, and trust me when I say, this fight was not engineered to work with the lock-on system, but that's just his first phase. After sorrowfully slaying his partner, the fight takes it up a notch with Nameless King fighting you himself. Now, his second phase is spectacular, and more than makes up for his first. Whilst fighting him, you'll really feel as if you're up against the God of War. But why exactly? Well, let's start by talking about the Nameless King's lightning, the power his father gifted him with so that he could slay all dragons. Lightning is used to such a great effect during his second phase, because it stops players from slacking. Sometimes attacks will be followed up with a lightning effect that can really catch players off guard, but if you're able to avoid them, it feels really rewarding. Also, the timing on Nameless King's attacks are very intense. For example, there's one attack where the Nameless King will call upon a bolt of lightning by thrusting his spear towards the sky, although the attack is slightly delayed, making it extremely hard to dodge. But hold up, there's even more, because after slaying his partner, the Nameless King now has access to the power of the Storm Dragon, which he uses to incredible effect. In fact, his second phase can start with him sending off 2 wind slashes. One acts as a wall between you and the Nameless King, while the other is a direct slash that looks as if it could tear you in two. And although the timings aren't that intense compared to his other moves, it doesn't matter because they're simply here to widen the Nameless King's attack pattern. Also, they feel like more of a distraction if anything, so the Nameless King can land even more brutal attacks. And the Nameless King's design is phenomenal. The armor he's wearing is constructed out of dragon scale, so he'll be able to defend himself against the dragon's fire by using their own flesh. However, it does more than just tell his backstory, it also makes him feel more connected to the dragons he ended up forming a bond with, and the fact he's using a spear that was originally created for the slaughter of all dragons whilst fighting alongside them is just a beautiful piece of irony that really hit me in the feels whilst watching Varty's video on him. But wait, we're not done quite yet, because I've only talked about the Nameless King and not the dragon he was riding, despite them playing a huge role during the first phase of this fight, so let's talk about them as well. I think they could have used just about any dragon for the Nameless King to ride, and I don't think people would have cared, but they specifically made it a storm dragon, something that's very fitting with the Nameless King. And let's be honest, if this dragon just looked the exact same as the ancient Wyvern, then I wouldn't even be mentioning them, but because From Software took their time whilst designing this boss, it really paid off. Everything I've just said about the Nameless King is what makes him my favourite boss in all of Dark Souls 3, and possibly my favourite Soulsborne boss in general, and I'm fully aware that isn't a popular opinion, and that's okay, because this video was solely made so I can give my opinion about bosses from a game that I really like, and I feel as if I've accomplished that. But before I finish, I've got a few things I'd like to say. Firstly, I want to apologise in case this script felt a little all over the place. I wanted to try some new things whilst writing it, and this is my first time writing a script ranking something, so it may have felt a little weird, but if you did enjoy and want more, then make sure to smash that like button, leave a comment down below, and hit that big red subscribe button with the bell on, because it shows me just how much you've enjoyed. And I'm gonna set a like goal. If this video hits 100 likes, I'll make a video just like this on every single Soulsborne game, which is gonna take a while and cost me a lot of money that I don't have, but if you hit the like goal, then I'll somehow make it happen. But that's all from me, so goodbye to you lovely, lovely people.